For those of you who maybe don't know me or maybe aren't a member of AODA yet or a member of the Gnostic Celtic Church yet, my name is Reverend Jack Campbell Jr., and I'm a bishop of the Gnostic Celtic Church, and I'm also the current preceptor. And as the preceptor, I'm primarily responsible for a couple of things. One is that anyone who's new to the Gnostic Celtic Church, anyone who comes into it, who's interested in it, oftentimes I'm their first contact, and I kind of help them through the initial grades, the grades that we'll talk about here in just a little bit. I'm also the sort of coordinator and head of the priesthood, and we'll talk about the difference between the priesthood and the monastery here in just a little bit as well, because it's something that even if you have the old clergy manual that's available on Amazon, you may not be entirely aware of because it's something that's sort of new and it's something that's evolved over time. I'm also the current Archdruid of Fire. For those who aren't familiar with AODA, we have essentially an Archdruid for each of the elements, and we all work together to essentially kind of guide AODA and kind of shape it as it goes forward, run day-to-day operations and things like that. In addition to AODA, I'm a member of a lot of different organizations and orders from OBOD, ADF. I'm in training as clergy for ADF as well as the Universal Gnostic Church. I'm a member of the Druidical Order of Golden Dawn and a number of other esoteric groups. My personal practice is very magico-religious. I'm a ritualist, occultist, and kind of et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the perspective I come from. I come from a very academic perspective, which is why I'll probably geek out on some of these facts and things like that, maybe more than some people would actually like. Um, but anyway, today we're here to talk about the Gnostic Celtic Church. So the easiest way to describe the Gnostic Celtic Church is that essentially we're a way to take the AODA tradition of Druidry and kind of work with it in a specifically religious way. People who are in AODA don't really have to be religious. They don't even really have to be spiritual, and they could still get a lot out of the curriculum, especially the way that we have the earth-centered, locally based ecosystem, the training that we have. There's a lot of value in it to people, even if they're not doing it as a religious practice. But the Gnostic Celtic Church sort of provides a way to take that with kind of a religious slant and also to receive ordination and consecration within the priesthood or within the monastery, as we'll get to in a little bit. The Gnostic Celtic Church actually only started existing in 2010. It was after some discussion with John Michael Greer, with some of the other Archdruids, that started around 2003, and they really wanted to take the ideas and the curriculum of the Universal Gnostic Church and offer that in a wider way to AODA itself. What some people may not realize is that all the Archdruids in AODA back to about like the early 1970s have been consecrated as bishops, independent bishops within the Universal Gnostic Church. We all hold that lineage ever since a bishop by the name of Matt Shaw, who went by Rodon Staris, became an Archdruid within AODA. He offered that consecration, and it's been kind of a tradition since then. GCC was really a way to kind of offer that out wider in AODA, but also to put a very AODA specific framework on it. So at the core of GCC, we have a few teachings that are part of the tradition itself. And a lot of them can really be found in the name Gnostic Celtic Church. So the three descriptors you could use to describe GCC are Gnostic, Universalist, and Pelagian. So through Gnosticism, we're not talking about like Gnostic Christianity. We're actually talking more about contemporary Gnosis, particularly like the French variety, the French Gnostics. And the idea is essentially that we can know the divine through our personal experience, through our personal observations, through our personal interactions. And this idea is pretty revolutionary because it kind of thwarts any idea of any kind of shared dogma. Um, at the core of our religious practice is always going to be our own personal experience with the divine, with the world, with our environment around us. And we inherited this from the Gnostic movement, as I mentioned. The second category is universalist, and if you're familiar with the Universalist Unitarian Church, the Universalists were a separate church originally prior to their combination with Unitarians, and the Universalists believed that all beings, without exception, would eventually enter into harmony with the divine. And so with this idea is that essentially that all of us and really all existence is always moving towards that sense of harmony, towards that sense of unification. So it's an important idea because it means that we can achieve that communion without the intervention of other people. And this also plays into Pelagius, who was a Christian mystic, and it was often used within the common Celtic Church, who Pelagius said essentially that salvation can only be attained by a person's own efforts. This was a huge deal in terms of very heretical at one point with the church, because it meant that you didn't need a priest, you didn't need bishops, you didn't need someone to essentially bless you and forgive you. You had to obtain all of that yourself. So when we combine all these together, we're essentially talking about an idea of personal freedom and personal responsibility for our own development as religious practitioners, as Druids, as people who are essentially mystics, modern mystics within this world. So we center ourselves around one rule, and that rule is called the Rule of Awen. And that's is very simply that all beings have a sacred duty to find and follow their own Awen. A lot of you are probably familiar with Awen in terms of AODA and how we talk about inspiration and the flow of it. But whenever you really get down to Awen, as it was written in Bardus by Iolo Morganug, sorry, I was kind of stumble over that name. Uh, it's really more than that. It's essentially like this spark of divinity that's essentially within every person at their birth. And when we talk about finding and following our own Awen, we're talking about working towards our unique reason for existence, essentially finding our calling, finding our true self. And this is a concept that you can see in a lot of different esoteric groups and various different religious groups, with the idea that we have a unique path, we have a unique calling, and that part of mysticism, part of religious life is essentially discerning that and following that. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's not a matter of just, this is the thing I want to do, this is the thing I feel like doing. We're talking about something very deep within in terms of your true self that perhaps you're not even entirely aware of. And whenever I talk about my personal experience, I often talk about the fact that a lot of these things that I do as part of my priesthood, the working with others, the crisis intervention, peer support, things like that I do, are things that I never really planned on doing. I really thought I would be kind of the hermit in the cave, reading books and meditating all day, and that's not what I got. In terms of a calling, I ended up working a lot more with people than I ever expected. So the other aspect of the Rule of Awen is essentially that I have to understand that you have a sacred duty to find and follow your own Awen as well. And that means that I can't interfere with your own Awen. And that's what goes back to our personal responsibility again, is that while I can try to assist you along the way, I can offer advice as needed. Ultimately, it's our own work, and we also can't impose that upon others, essentially. So the other concepts that are an important part of GCC that kind of make the framework of our practices and the church itself are the gnosis of nature, the doctrine of one, and the hermitage of the heart. The gnosis of nature essentially goes back to that idea of mysticism and gnosis, but specifically that through nature, we can best know the divine. We can best, see it and experience it. And that's real where this really ties in well with AODA. All those books of your local ecosystem that myself or Jamie probably approved or prescribed to you or anything like that, those are all to help build that knowledge and that understanding of what is happening within your local ecosystem so that you can observe it, you can see what's happening, you can learn from it. Nature can be your teacher, which is really one of the primary pieces of AODA as a whole. The doctrine of one essentially goes into this idea that all things are part of a larger whole. How you define that whole may change depending on different things, whether that's a greater being, whether that's like some of you will read the Kabbalion, when they talk about the all and things like that. But essentially that everything is connected, everything affects each other. We're all part of the same thing. Even if you break it down to science and you say we're all part of the same matter, we're all connected, and that appreciation of that whole is an important part of some of the rituals that we do. The last piece is called the Hermitage of the Heart. And the Hermitage of the Heart is really the practices we do to help kind of set us apart from the daily grind, to help remind us of our religious life, to kind of protect ourselves from the negative influences that can so often kind of derail us, that can pull us away from our Awen. And these are a lot of different things. One of them is the spirit protection, that you all learn as part of AODA. The daily practice of that could help shield you from that. But it's also a reminder that our entire life is essentially divine. Our entire life is work, because as the Doctrine of One says, everything is essentially divine. So the Hermitage of the Heart reminds us to take moments throughout the day, even if they're small moments, with little practices, meditations, little rituals that can kind of help remind you that you are that your life is sacred, that your path is sacred, even when everything around you feels mundane. That's why I'm a big believer in little practices like praying at different times throughout the day, meditating, and even if it's just small meditations. One of the things I teach to a lot of Druids is that I do a breathing exercise where I draw the telluric current up into my body, and then I breathe out and I draw the solar current down into my body, and I just work it back and forth to kind of center myself at various times throughout the day. Just little things like that to help you, remind you that there's more than just what you're experiencing at the time. So everybody that comes into the Gnostic Celtic Church starts as a novitiate, and the novitiate and the diaconate essentially create a common root for GCC and how things tend to grow from there. The novitiate grade is actually a pretty new thing. It didn't really exist until probably around 2020. And Kathleen developed it as a way to essentially give people who are candidates the option of starting to learn within the Gnostic Celtic Church and really start to kind of work with some of the concepts, work with some of the rituals, and really kind of develop that part of their life. Prior to that, you had to be an apprentice before you could get into GCC. And myself, Kathleen, some others, we had specifically been drawn to AODA in part because of GCC. And quite honestly, I had been doing communion for almost a year before I actually applied to join GCC. So everybody comes in as a novitiate, and that lines up with our candidate grade. If you're an apprentice, you still come in as a novitiate. Your novitiate time is just a little bit shorter because you don't have to complete all the AODA curriculum. From there, also as part of the novitiate grade, what I should talk about is that the novitiate grade is really about taking stock in your religious life, in your personal theology, and really looking at where you've been and where you are right now. The where you've been, for those of you in GCC, was essentially that spiritual autobiography that you sent me, where you take a look at your spiritual life, how it developed, and you really intentionally look at that. And then the the use of the My Deepest Me book that we use within the curriculum allows you to really drill down and look at where you are right now. And for some people, this is the first time in their life they've really been given permission to take stock of their religious life and really look at it in terms of how it got the way it is, why it is the way it is. Because for some of us, it was essentially formed by where we're born, the communities we're born into. So this is permission to really start looking at it. And that's an important part of finding and following your own Awen. So when somebody becomes an apprentice within GCC, they're eligible to become a deacon within, or apprentice within AODA. They're eligible to become a deacon within GCC. And that's where we really start looking at where you want to go from there. I bless a stone with the current of the Gnostic Celtic Church, and I send it out to all the deacons. That allows them to kind of experiment with it. They can kind of feel that current. They can use it in meditation and ritual, and start discerning like what is their calling, where is their Awen trying to lead them, in addition to the rest of the curriculum, which are books and things like that. And from there, there's a few different ways that things can go. One is that there's no pressure to ever leave the diaconate if you don't want to. You can stay a deacon forever. The deacon, there's a lot of people that like working with the stone, they like working with the rituals, but they just have no desire to go forward farther than that. Then there's people that may decide that the Gnostic Celtic Church isn't for them at all, and that's entirely okay. Part of a religion that's centered on finding and following your own path is that if your path leads you away from GCC, then that's just something that happens, right? It's not a failure. You're still following upon your path. The other two ways are through the priesthood and through the monastery. So the priesthood goes from the diaconate to priest. And so a priest is someone who is a companion within AODA. So they've completed that part of the curriculum, and they've completed the curriculum for the priest, which has some books to read, has some reflections to write. They've really started to reflect on those aspects of things, how they affect their vocation, and they've really started to take shape in terms of where they want to go and what kind of priest they want to be. They also receive ordination, which is part of the reason that a lot of people will join GCC is because they're specifically searching that ordination for a variety of different reasons. For some people in some states, that ordination may be enough for them to be able to do ceremonies like marriages, funerals, things like that. In other states, it may not. And that's one of the things that I often talk to priests about is determining what their local laws are if they're interested in doing different types of service work. And we'll get to what some of those are here in a little bit. When somebody becomes an adept in AODA, they're able to become apply to be a bishop in GCC. A bishop in GCC is somebody who essentially embodies that tradition. They have a vocation that supports AODA, that supports GCC, that supports their communities, and they receive consecration in that lineage that I'll actually get into in a little bit here as well. So when I talk about the priesthood, a lot of times we talk about service, but service means a lot of different things in the way that we practice it. The original priesthood of AODA or of GCC, I always get those mixed up as well. The original priesthood within GCC didn't really do things like chaplaincy. They didn't do things like pastoral counseling. Their primary act of service was the communion ritual itself. It was essentially a magical ritual to put a blessing into the earth and to radiate it out to all life. And that's still a very valid way of serving nature, of serving our communities, of serving the earth. It's the earth and everything that lives upon it, to steal a line from the communion ritual. But as we developed as a church, we found a lot of people that wanted to take it in new directions. And we decided that rather than just kind of, have them go off on their own and figure it out, we decided to try to support people a little better in that. And over the years, we've had a number of people do a lot of different things. So if you think in terms of serving individuals, those rites of passage, And it's not limited to just, funerals and weddings and things like that. I often use those as examples because that's what we're familiar with like some of the more common churches. But there's some really beautiful rituals around like, coming of age or going off to college, going off to war, going buying a car and anything like that. Just any kind of common rite of passage can be easily marked by a ritual. And some people would say that's something that we're desperately missing within modern society, and that has resulted in us kind of being a little bit listless as a people. Uh, some people go into a wider community in terms of service with chaplaincy, such as in the military or within different groups. I mentioned that I'm a ritualist, so doing forming rituals, whether they're magical or rites of passage, or even just like your seasonal rituals that people can attend and things of that nature. Within AODA, we have a lot of mentors. We always need more. So if you're feeling called to be a mentor once you reach the apprentice level, please, volunteer for mentoring. We're always looking for volunteers in AODA for a variety of different things, and that is an active service as well. And then also just any kind of other type of service that you can even imagine. There's no limit to it. If you're interested in volunteering in a hospice, doing divination, energy work, anything like that, again, just know your local laws, but you can reach out and really bring that into your religious practice as essentially a calling. The important thing is just, remember the rule of Awen. It's you're finding and following your own path. And as long as you're not trying to impose it on others, you're good. Within the monastery, we have 3 levels of monk that sort of start along with the diaconate. So the first is the novice monk, and that's where you start really learning about monasticism and contemplation, and that's where people first usually get their entry into working one-on-one with Kathleen if they're interested in the monastery versus the priesthood. The committed monk learns specifically about vows and begins to create the sort of vows that might guide them in the future or that might be specific to GCC or AODA. Where this breaks off a little bit from the priesthood is that a committed monk isn't necessarily a companion within AODA. They're also not ordained, which is part of the trade-off on that. If somebody wants to advance past that to the consecrated monk, then they do have to complete the AODA curriculum. And similar to what we talked about with the bishop, that this is a person who essentially embodies the tradition of the monastery itself, and they will receive the same consecration that the bishop receives. They're more likely to be involved in leadership and kind of working within the monastery to keep it running, or within AODA itself. So the energetic current of GCC is very diverse, much like the church itself. We're kind of unique amongst the sort of Druid churches in that we have people from almost every type of theology and religious background that you can imagine. Every mainstream religion, most of the minor religions are represented or have been at one time or another. And our current is a lot like that too. The 2 biggest pieces of it are probably apostolic succession. We do have a line of consecration through the independent sacrament movement, specifically, that goes back to I believe 2 different disciples of Jesus, as a hands-on documented lineage. The second piece of the energetic current of GCC is really from that universal Gnostic Church, and that includes all the Archdruids, but most recently from Reverend John Gilbert, who passed that on to John Michael Greer prior to the Universal Gnostic Church sort of shutting down, although it has recently reopened, and I know that myself and Claire are taking part in that currently, but it's essentially the same consecration in that way. So, but then there's also a lot of other miscellaneous pieces. one of the things that is really interesting about AODA, its Archdruids, and its tradition is that we tend to be people who have a really diverse set of interests. We tend to get involved in a lot of different orders and a lot of different esoteric movements. And so we've inherited some of those lines as well from some of these groups that John Gilbert or Juliet Ashley or some of these people were involved in. And then on top of that, because we're a constantly evolving church, we're a constantly evolving practice, we also have some natural lines of consecration that were recently added by Dana, our current Grand Archdruid. So it's a really diverse current. The the apostolic piece of it is sometimes difficult for people, but it's something to be aware of if people want to pursue ordination and consecration, and something that people found very satisfying and useful just overall. The entire energetic current can be used in a lot of different ways. So there's some core practices that we share with people whenever they come into GCC, and these practices can kind of make the cornerstone of just a religious practice, especially for people who maybe don't have a regular practice. One is morning prayer. So you choose like what kind of prayer you want to do. It doesn't matter what it is. I actually pray several times a day in several different ways for several different things. The Universal Druid prayer is always a good one to know because we actually use that in our Grove opening. So that's a good one to know for your communion ritual anyway. I usually say that one every day, along with a series of about probably 6 or 7 other prayers that I say in the morning. Then we also advise you to have a home altar, and it's essentially like a physical representation of your religious life, of your practice. It can be just one, but I actually have several different places that I would consider to be altars. As I sit here right now in my area that I often do my writing in, I have a little shrine type thing to Bridget, to the Morrigan, as well as some other things. And I have these various little areas throughout the house. And what those are really helpful for is when I talked about the hermitage of the heart, is they're a constant reminder of the presence of my religious life in every aspect of my life. The third is evening lection. And lection is also a part of the communion ritual, but it's essentially just reading with intention. You can use discursive meditation like we learn in AODA. You could just read and then think deeply about what you've just read, how it applies to you. Or you can do as formal as a version of Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina is essentially divine reading, and you essentially read slowly, do some meditation on that passage itself. You pray, and then you open yourself up for further influences from within or from without to see if anything new arises. It can be very rewarding, but it also takes a long time to get through a book. So you wouldn't want to do a 700-page book like that, but poetry works great for it. The triads, various things like that are just fantastic for it. As ritual practices that are common within GCC, we have the Spear of Protection, which is shared with AODA. We have the communion ritual. The communion ritual we'll talk about more in a second, but it's required for priests. They do the communion ritual essentially once every other week, at least, preferably more than that. We have some seasonal rituals that are part of the GCC clergy manual. Some people use them, some people don't. And then just whatever else calls to you. I often do 2 or 3 rituals around some of these holidays because of my practices with other groups, or just because I'm doing various other things around it. Like I said, I'm very magico-religious, occult heavy, so I ritual a lot. I'm not saying that everybody else has to, it's just whatever your calling is. So the communion ritual itself is kind of a misnomer for some people, especially if they've had experience within the Catholic Church or within Christianity. We're not talking about communion in terms of those things. Like those types of communion are linked to a very specific event at a very specific time. We're talking about communion in more of a grander scale in terms of like unification with all life and with all existence. And that includes both life within this realm and life within the spiritual realm. And it all links back to that idea of the doctrine of one. The communion ritual is essentially like a celebration of that. We're celebrating the fact that we recognize that we are one with all things. Afterwards, I feel a little bit like an antenna. So it's like almost literally feeling like I'm one with everything. And it's also a working towards Gwynfith. And to kind of explain Gwynfith like in a very short terms, um, Gwynfith is a Druid idea of like a spiritual realm. So Obred is the physical realm, Gwynfith is the spiritual realm. And the ideas that are listed within the communion ritual talk about achieving Gwynfith. So we're talking about that unification with the spirit realm of essentially celebrating the spiritual part of ourselves and supporting that. That can be very literal if you want to see it that way. It can be very metaphorical if you want to see it that way. Ultimately, there's not a whole lot of definitions for a lot of the stuff, and people experience it in different ways. So the way the communion ritual is set up is that we have the solitary grove opening and closing, where we create that sacred time, that sacred space, where we can do a number of different things like work magic or celebrate the different seasons. And in this particular ritual, we're setting it up as space for that communion. Then after that, there's a short reading with a meditation where we do some lections. So we'll read a short passage and we'll meditate as a group. If we do it together, then we meditate together, reading the passage out loud. As by yourself, it's a little it's even simpler because you can just pick whatever you want to read. The liturgy itself involves the calling of the various powers, the elements, the telluric and solar currents into the bread and wine that we have on the altar, so that we can then ingest it, and through ingesting it, make it one with us. And then at the end of the ritual, as we end it, we essentially release all the energy that we've gathered, everything that remains. We send it into the earth as a blessing to the earth and all that lives upon it. So there's a lot of different pieces of the communion ritual where we're celebrating that kind of like unification with the one. We're learning about ourselves through meditation and our readings. We're getting more familiar with those powers that we always call upon within the SOP anyway. And we're also issuing that blessing to the earth itself. So within the monastery and within the priesthood, we have some different events in order to try to help build that sense of community. When I first came into GCC, I had no idea how many people were in GCC. In fact, I didn't know how many priests, bishops, anything there were until I was literally the preceptor. So we've tried to build more of a sense of community. The monastery's been really good at that so far. At least most Sundays, they'll have some sort of Zoom event, whether that's healing meditations. You can see an application on the forum if you know somebody or you yourself want to be the target of a healing meditation. You can put that information in there and they'll be happy to add you. They do Lectio Divina together, sacred readings together, and then they also have their community meetings. Within the priesthood, we haven't had as much because, like I mentioned, I didn't mention earlier, but I've just finished an academic program in business, and that's taken a lot of time. But within the priesthood, I'm planning on having similar events, such as the upcoming liturgy workshop that I'll be leading. In that workshop, I'll be talking about common ritual structures, including the solitary grove and just the grove setup in general, how it kind of reflects a lot of the different rituals that we see in other traditions and how it can be used for different things. And then also how to just go about writing your own liturgy for different rites of passage for different seasons or anything like that. But I'm also like I'm also open to doing a lot of other types of priesthood events, and these may include everything from having somebody that's like has, if we have a lot of people that do community ministry or hospice work, funeral rites, and things of that nature, or crisis intervention or anything like that. And I would like to offer some workshops in those types of skills from the people in our priesthood that have them, as a way to help them, allow them to share some of those things with all of us, but also as a way to give everybody the sort of skills that can really be useful in every part of your daily life. So if you want to know more information about the Gnostic Celtic Church, the best place in terms of just general info is probably the website. We do have our own page, or pages, I guess, within the website. Within the forum, there's a sub forum that you can go into and ask questions. And then also the two Gmail addresses there. The Gnostic Celtic Church Gmail would go to me. The GCC Monastery email goes to Kathleen. And if you're interested in joining those community events that the monastery has, you don't have to be a monk. You don't even have to be in GCC. If you email Kathleen, she'll send you a Zoom link, and you'll be able to take part in those things and see how they feel to you. The lines of definition between the priests and between the monks are very, very, very blurry and gray. The priests all have a very contemplative life in addition to their service-oriented life, and there's a lot of monks that do various acts of service. So there is no limit to switching back and forth between the two, or experiencing the events that the others are doing. We're all part of the same church, and we're all part of the same community within AODA. And then also within Discord, we have some channels. There's a public channel in GCC in Discord, and I'm in there on a fairly regular basis and answering questions for people. So that's another good way to get me if you don't want to have to email me or use the forum.